Good afternoon from Europe. Good morning to the US. I am Vasilis Dousas from the Foundation for European Progressive Studies in Brussels. Thank you all for joining us for day 2 of our annual State of the Union's conference, co-organized by FEPS and the German Marshall Fund of the United States. I don't know how many of you tuned in to yesterday's discussion that focused more on the domestic dynamics and consequences of the US election of past week. Today, we're going to focus more on foreign policy, the transatlantic relationship, and of course, the transatlantic dimension when it comes to the future of the multilateral system, which both partners, the US and Europe, have always been critical parts in leading, but also building. Let me say big thanks to the wonderful team at GMF and my own colleagues at FEPS, who have worked tirelessly to bring us all together. And many thanks to all of you for showing up. We have a great group of people with us today to help decode, in a way, what comes next after this momentous but not entirely decisive election, decisive at least in terms of what many people expected, the repudiation of the creed of foreign policy the outgoing occupant of the White House has promoted for the past 4 years. Before I give them the floor, or before I introduce them rather, let me say that you can always submit your questions through the Q&A function. After a round of initial interventions, some follow-ups, I'll open up the Q&A. So feel free to submit your questions there. Always identify yourself and ideally who you want your question to be answered by. Now, turning to the panel, as I said, we have a great group of people. Let me briefly introduce them. We have Ambassador Victoria Nuland, who's a senior counselor at the Albright Stonebridge group. Who's also a former Assistant Secretary of State for European Eurasian Affairs at the U.S. State Department. We have Jamie Fly, Senior Fellow and Senior Advisor to the President at GMF. We have Maria João Rodrigues, who's the President of FEPS. And last but not least, we're joined by Ambassador Stavros Lambrinidis, who's the EU Ambassador to the U.S. Now we have about 55 minutes ahead of us, so I'm going to start quite quickly by turning to Ambassador Nuland. Ambassador, the U.S. has just elected probably the most pro-transatlantic president in decades, and President-elect Biden soon will have the unenviable task of putting a meaningful end to the turbulence and at times the absurdity that was the last 4 years. But from a US perspective, your own perspective, to a European audience, us in Europe, what can we expect from US engagement with Europe in a new administration, in a Biden administration? And perhaps what impact do we expect to see on relations with NATO allies? Ambassador, you have the floor.
Well, thanks, Vasilis. It's great to be with FEPS and with GMF and with my friends and colleagues here on the panel. I want to start by saying that I am not speaking today for President-elect Biden or for the transition team around him. I am going to give you my views based on what has been said publicly and lots of time working with the president-elect during the Obama administration. So let me just start there. I think the obvious point is that Joe Biden, in his bones and in what he's already said, is the human repudiation of the America first, America alone policy of the Trump administration. He is, as you said, firmly committed to the transatlantic alliance and considers himself one of its builders and architects. You can expect, I think, very early, within the first quarter, a visit to Europe, which will include G7, EU, NATO, an effort to reinforce his firm commitment that the United States should pursue its security, its prosperity, support for its values and global rules of the road around the world with its closest allies, with the great democracies, and that Europe is a linchpin for that, a reassertion, obviously, of the commitment to Article 5. I think you will see a very quick assertion of a new agenda and a hope that Europe will join in that agenda. Obviously, first and foremost, beating this pandemic and trying to do it jointly and do it quickly. Economic renewal, his Build Back Better slogan, and Europe is engaged in its own version of this with its decision to link COVID recovery funds to greener technologies, more modern economic leap, if you will. But he will also be rigorous, I think, about addressing some of the challenges that we share, whether it is a far more assertive China that is becoming a significant security, economic, and technological rival, whether it is dealing with Russia, as we always have, but doing it in a more coordinated and pointed way. The challenge of technology, ensuring that the technological rules of the road favor freedom in the first instance, but also that there is a fairness built in. And there will be some effort to ensure that as the EU moves forward on these issues, that we do things jointly, that we are not cutting at cross purposes or setting up some of these rules in ways that penalize each other, but instead trying to build a community jointly that sets rules that make it harder for the authoritarians to use these technologies to hurt us or to expand their surveillance systems, et cetera. Obviously, the green agenda is huge as part of economic renewal. He has said he will come back into Paris on day one, but that's just the beginning. And then there are lots of Middle East challenges from, Iran, and what do you do about the JCPOA? What do you do about Iran's territorial march, et cetera, the Russia-Iranian joining to the fact that the Middle East is bleeding in many, many places. So there's a huge amount of work to do. I would just put two other points on the table that have to be thought about. One is, this will be the first democratic administration post-Brexit, and there will be an interest in ensuring that we end up in our transatlantic conversation with a three-legged stool, the US, the UK, the EU, and that we're finding a way to pursue all these issues in common. So can the US play a role in cementing the UK into a strong role in defending our security, our prosperity, our values, and not end up with little England or with more spinning across the channel? And then there are the trade issues, where there has been signaling that there will not be a renewed effort at a huge, big trade deal, but we do have significant issues that have to be worked through, and we have far too many regulatory barriers against each other. So what can we do in the transatlantic space, but also with our Asian allies, to ensure that we are renovating our economies and building back better in a way that reduces the frictions and the barriers without having to get into endless negotiations over it. So I'll just pause there.
Many thanks, Ambassador. Just a quick follow-up on that. Do you expect this new agenda domestically, also foreign policy-wise, as part of the incoming administration, but also vis-a-vis Europe, to be an easy endeavor? And I'm mostly referring to two things. One is the fact that, many people say, it has become within a week the new cliche within the blob that, Trump may be gone, but Trump is here to stay. So some features of the Trump administration are here to stay, whether we want them or not. And secondly, you also talked about, trade cooperation, but also some thorny trade issues vis-a-vis the EU. Just today, we had the EU imposing or announcing it's imposing billions in tariffs on US products and prolonging in a way the Trump trade war despite the Biden victory. Also just today, we had the Commission unveiling antitrust charges against Amazon. So these are thorny issues that somehow need to be diffused going forward. But do you expect this whole endeavor to be easier than many people think?
No, I think it's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of flexibility. And I also think that times have changed. You don't rewind the tape back 4 years. For example, it is a bipartisan conviction now in the United States, Democrats and Republicans, that we have to be more rigorous in the way we approach China, and we have to be more comprehensive. I think Europe is coming around to that, but we don't have the structures together to address the trade issues, the technology issues, the infrastructure issues, the protection of our critical pathways together. And sometimes when you're working together, that's when the hard work works. That Washington may, after a period of spitting on Europe, be actually more demanding in what it is asking. And I agree with you that the technology issues are going to be particularly thorny. Everything from how you deal with privacy to how you deal with tax, antitrust, all of those things. But ideally, we will build some rules of the road together, because the larger challenge out there is coming from the authoritarians, is coming from China, Russia, Iran, who want to abuse these technologies for their own purposes. So we in the democratic world have to get our act together, and it has to be fair and open, protect our citizens, but also make use of these great technologies, including the ones that are applicable for security, artificial intelligence, quantum, et cetera. So yes, I think the Biden administration may be more demanding than allies are expecting, but in a good way, in a way that has confidence in Europe to be our partner in meeting the great challenges.
All right, many thanks. Let me just now turn to Jamie Fly. Jamie, Ambassador Nuland spoke of a new agenda. The Biden administration is going to move quickly to assert a new agenda. As part of this new agenda, which we all understand is in the making, what role do you see for the US to play on the global stage post-2020? And perhaps with a little bit of focus on the issue of multilateralism, multilateral institutions and arrangements, which has been a very evident area where the Trump administration, to put it bluntly, has wanted to wreak havoc. So what's your take on this?
Thanks. Well, thanks for having me, and it's great to be with everyone. I guess I'll answer that by maybe first just talking a little bit post-election about where American politics sits at this point, because I think it relates, especially if you look at the state of the Republican Party. It's really where we can find the answer to your question. Donald Trump obviously did much better, I think, than many people anticipated a week ago. That, unfortunately, in my opinion, as a Republican, but a non-Trump supporting Republican, is likely going to give him a seat at the table, at least for the foreseeable future, when it comes to many of these topics. And you've just seen that even in the last several days, and the fact that very few Republicans in Congress have even been willing to kind of start pushing him towards the door for fear of an angry tweet from Donald Trump Jr., for instance, or from the president himself. So I think there are going to be elements of Trumpism that continue to maintain a hold on the Republican Party. I think you'll probably see that in trade. You already had that before Trump when it came to multilateral institutions and international cooperation. That's not a new dynamic, really. Donald Trump kind of took it to the next level in how his administration pursued a lot of these issues on the world stage. But that's something that's been with the party for decades, and I think will continue. I'll just note, though, that although I think Tori is absolutely correct, Vice President Biden, soon to be President Biden, is going to present a different face, a more positive attitude towards the transatlantic relationship and cooperation. His own party is also going through a lot of turmoil and will continue to do so, even as he takes the White House. This last election, I think, was not as decisive as many had hoped in terms of answering some fundamental questions about the trajectory of American politics. And just as you've seen a lot of debating about what it means for the future of the Republican Party, a lot of Democrats in especially the House have been arguing with each other over the last week about why they didn't do better, about what the right approach is to win future elections. And so I think this all leaves America especially if you have divided government with Republicans controlling the Senate. Many of those Republican senators looking towards a potential presidential run in 2024, it has all the recipes for gridlock. And I think it makes America a divided, distracted, disengaged partner, which is going to place some limits, unfortunately, on how much even an administration with the best intentions can do when it comes to engaging allies. I certainly agree with Toria that China is an area that the Biden team seems to be prioritizing. I think it's one of the few areas where there's broad bipartisan agreement, including in Congress. It also has the added value in the US debate of bringing in some bipartisan agreement on certain types of economic policy, which I think 5 or 10 years ago was not the case. But you've now seen, even on the right, increased support for new government subsidies for certain industries, a kind of US industrial policy to make the US more competitive vis-a-vis China, and also to protect certain national security sectors. I think that fits very nicely with some of the messages coming out of the Biden campaign about making the US more competitive vis-a-vis China. And so I think China is an important issue where the administration will hopefully come with some tangible asks to the Europeans, and hopefully our European partners will be ready to engage. I'll just end by saying beyond China, I guess I'm a bit more pessimistic maybe about prospects in the relationship. I think certainly on climate, on JCPOA, there's a lot of common proposals. The problem is those are topics where there's very little bipartisan agreement in the United States. And so I think our European partners run the risk of concluding arrangements with a Biden administration that may not survive beyond 4 years. We already went through this dynamic from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. And so I think that those areas perhaps have their limits in terms of putting the transatlantic relationship on a sustainable bipartisan course that can last beyond just one administration. One area where I think more can be done that I hope a Biden administration will prioritize is on Europe's periphery. It's an area that I think is clearly close to Joe Biden's heart from what I've seen. It's an area, having just led Radio for Europe, Radio Liberty for a year, where we desperately need more attention from Washington and from Brussels. We've got major challenges to democracy, to the rule of law, threats against independent media. Some of these challenges are not just in the Eastern Partnership countries, but also within EU member states like Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania. And this is an area where I don't think there has been enough transatlantic dialogue during the Trump administration. And it's an area I think that's ripe for transatlantic cooperation. And so hopefully it's something that will be prioritized early on by the Biden administration. So I'll stop there.
Jamie, many thanks. Just a quick comment, since you started with a domestic dimension. You know, we're seeing something unfolding these past few days in the US. And with what you said, you know, how domestic politics can influence international postures, the future of the US foreign policy orientation, you know, the US Senate is hanging from a balance. And, you know, the past few days, we've seen very few Republicans, you know, accepting the outcome of the elections, and more Republicans forming ranks with, around Trump, backing a legal push to contest Biden's victory, which might be short-lived as an effort in the short term. But is the truth in saying that it might delegitimize this outcome and might hamper the room of leverage a Biden administration will have going forward in terms of legitimacy across the US public? Is this something that you feel has any credence, or do you think it's just a last-minute effort to save face?
I think I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think right now it's just an effort to allow the president to save face, to let some of these cases work their way through the courts. And given that it doesn't appear that there's been any real evidence put forward by the campaign's lawyers, likely fail. I think we'll know more in a couple of weeks. If we're still debating this issue 3 or 4 weeks from now, I think we'll have bigger problems. I will say, though, that the way this is already being covered in conservative, especially amongst conservative media, does raise the significant danger that a large segment of the Republican electorate will not believe that Joe Biden was legitimately elected. That was going to happen anyways because of the way that President Trump handled himself during the campaign and already started to plant seeds of doubt. But I think this added to just how close the outcome was, how well President Trump did, and including with some surprising demographics with Hispanics, apparently, with African-American men. I think it's going to make it more difficult for Republicans in the Senate to find areas of common ground with a Biden administration. But I think we'll know more in a couple of weeks about how much damage will be done. It's too early to tell at this point.
All right, many thanks, Jamie. Now let me turn to the Europeans of the panel. Ambassador Lambrinidis, let me start with you. Following this period of turbulence in the bilateral relationship, and looking ahead, what do you think, could or perhaps should substantiate this new joint transatlantic agenda that Ambassador Nuland spoke of going forward?
Well, I think, and please, if there's an issue with connection, let me know, because I've been having some issues. I think there's both a very positive agenda that has to be pursued immediately, based on the joint interest that we have as the biggest economies in the world, the most connected, to get out of COVID stronger. The European economy and its recovery is going to be the biggest, most important boost to the U.S. economy as well, if we are successful, and vice versa. We have tremendous interest there. We have to keep the trade between us and the investment open, even as we re-examine supply chains and resilience and all those things that COVID has made us do. And we must not fall into the dangers of becoming protectionistic, but certainly work more closely together. I think we also will be inspired by the fact that this is a different world. We do have dangers out there, much more assertive powers such as China, that represent an entirely different value structure than we do, Americans and Europeans. But a China that is also important and necessary to work with when we have to address some of the biggest challenges, such as climate change. It's not a hoax, it's not going away. And China is the biggest polluter. China, the US returning to the Paris Agreement, supremely important. But then putting concrete teeth behind those commitments, as we are trying to do in Europe, is going to be supremely important for us, and we'll be working very closely with the Biden administration on this. And then we will also be supporting efforts to ensure that other countries around the world come into the fold and fulfill the commitments. So there's going to be a very strong positive agenda and a strong agenda, defensive, if you like, but very important for our security and our prosperity. Now, let me just say that, first of all, these elections were remarkable. I watched them as the EU ambassador. I don't vote. I don't express an opinion. I watch. And it was remarkable because in spite of the tremendous polarization in the country, which cannot be denied, an election was run fundamentally supremely well and supremely efficiently, as we saw it from here. There was an outpouring of volunteerism on all sides, volunteers, observing the counts, heroic people counting ballots, a huge number of mail-in ballots because of COVID. And yet it all happened fundamentally, remarkably smoothly. And more people voted, in fact, than ever before in US history, I think. And we have to remember this as Europeans, which is because it is important. And so what is also important is what's going to be happening now in these weeks as well, the smoothness of the democratic transition. And I say this because keep in mind, when I say that there are countries out there that are trying to export right now very different governance values than Americans and Europeans hold, those countries are looking at what we do, and they relish being able to argue that our democracies are dysfunctional, that we are polarized to the extent that we are paralyzed. And you know what? Yeah, maybe they're not that free, but at least come to us, come to us. It's more kumbaya. In the end, people get a little more money, a little less freedom, but it's okay. So it's not okay. It's not okay. And we have to be vigilant in the US and in Europe to ensure that we protect our democracy and that we project around the world that these are functioning democracies. So I was very pleased to see how the election process went up to now. A woman, a black woman, an Indian woman, for the first time becomes vice president. Let's not forget about the struggles and the emphasis that Europe and the European Union has been placing on women's rights and women's empowerment around the world in all our policies. That is a remarkable thing, and a remarkable thing to note. It's shattering ceilings, and it's very important. Like we shattered the ceiling with Ursula von der Leyen being being the president of the Commission, or heck, Maria João being the president of FEPS. And Maria João, so great to see you. Now. Toria mentioned that the Biden administration will be coming back with some important ideas and asks for Europe. And I would say that's going to be great. And at the same time, I can assure you that we are, as Europeans, are already preparing ourselves a positive proposal, agenda to the next administration to work on things. And that is a result of the fact that the past 4 years have changed not just the US and not just the world, but Europe as well. I have been saying to my European friends for the past few months, not knowing who's going to win, but now that a Democrat has, I suppose, it's not a bad thing to be quoting Kennedy. We in Europe should be, asking not what the United States can do for us. We should be asking what we can do to make Europe even stronger and even more united, and therefore through that to make the transatlantic partnership as well stronger and more united. The US will indeed be looking for a Europe that is a stronger and more effective partner, and our ability to be exactly that, whether it is in recovering our economy and ensuring, as we're doing now with the Next Generation EU Fund, that we are showing solidarity to all our member states, that we are trying to tackle the fundamental fuel of populism, which is inequalities that were brought about by unhindered globalization, an issue that has been discussed here in the States as well very strongly. These may be, and are in fact, examples of a stronger Europe that also could serve as an inspiration to a US that is also tackling these issues, healthcare, unemployment, benefits, social safety nets, all these things. Not easy issues in this country, but certainly there's a place for Americans and Europeans to discuss them. COVID, in addition to dealing with the crisis itself and ensuring we prepare for future pandemics, let us not forget that not just Americans and not just Europeans have been hit by this. In Europe, we realized this very early on. And we realized that there were countries going around trying to act like the new Mother Teresa's, claiming that we democracies were selfish and inefficient in tackling this crisis, and they were not. And nothing could be further from the truth. We set up Team Europe in Europe. We have given more than 35 billion euros to the WHO, to poor countries around the world, to boost their health system, to boost their social safety nets, because they are suffering as much as anyone else. And if we don't manage to show leadership in eliminating the virus from everywhere, even if we manage to do it in our borders, the crisis will not be over. So in that sense, I think, and I hope that the US comes into COVAX, ensures that we all work together in establishing our leadership around the world, a humanitarian, a solidarity leadership to all these countries who are sitting on the fence and are wondering who are the ones in the big crisis who can support them. You want to take an issue like the environment. There I see a tremendous possibility of cooperation. And I think that the EU is in a position with its own innovation in this field, both economic innovation, business innovation, regulatory innovation, to be able to be talking to the United States and to be coordinating together our approaches. A carbon border tax that we are discussing in Europe is not something that the US should not be discussing. They should as well. We have to make sure that as we try to transition, we can create a level playing field around the world. There cannot be companies subsidized by others who violate environmental laws, violate labor laws, violate everything else, and then expect to be competing with our companies who are trying to do the best to be socially responsible for today and for the next generations. That's an area of cooperation that I see, but certainly the US coming back to the Paris Agreement would be a tremendous inspiration. Let me just make clear, Europe is stronger and different and bigger than it was 4 years ago and more united, but the US remains the indispensable country for the world order that we're building. So, you know, we have to be strong partners, but the US has to be there with us leading. And this is fundamentally the hope. Vasily, if you want me to stop, I will, because I know your time is running out, but there's many more to say, but I think these are some good things to frame the thinking as we have it.
Many thanks, Ambassador. Certainly excellent points. And I can already see there's various questions on those particular points, so we'll come back to that. Now, let me just turn to Maria João Rodrigues. I think it's a nice segue, you know, what Ambassador Lambrinidis just spoke about, you know, and given your policy background, having served at the European Parliament, you know, what's your take on what could be the concrete pathways through which the transatlantic relationship can be renewed?
Well, first of all, my warm greetings to our friends in the United States, the American ones, and also the European one. Stavros, big greetings also for you, our ambassador there. Great times for all of us. I must say that we are still digesting the outcome of this turning point in the United States, but from the European viewpoint, this is perceived as a big moment of relief and also of hope, I must say. Relief because we were going to difficult times, having for the first time in history, an American president conducting a kind of systemic challenge to the multilateral system in different important fronts. The climate, the trade, the migration, the culture, the security with the Iran deal, and then the last straw in the coffin, it was the health and the pandemic's lack of cooperation. Now, from the European viewpoint, election of someone like Biden brings a lot of hope. And we already see important signals of this turning point when it comes to the climate, when it comes the cooperation on the pandemics, when it comes the way to use a vaccine, if this is really confirmed. And also when it comes organizing a full international cooperation to deal with the unfolding social and economic crisis. So I do think that we have many reasons for hope and for resetting our relationship with our strategic, crucial partner as the United States are. Now, if you ask me which are the areas where we can reset this partnership, let me tell you, I think there are many. From the European viewpoint, I don't think that the European Union should just wait. The European Union needs to be active, proactive about this. This is very clear on climate, because in fact, the European Union is leading, and other partners are also available to move forward across the world. But of course, it's very important to have a stronger collaboration with the United States. The other example will be this coordinated recovery and build back better. This is, I think, a very good approach, because this coincides exactly with our concern of using the recovery to transform our economies and societies according to a new Green Deal and a better use of digital transformation. I would say that when it comes to trade, this will be probably a bit more problematic. The bilateral relationship should be relaunched from my viewpoint, but we also have a lot to do together on the multilateral framework when it comes also relaunching WTO, which is dealing with many difficulties so far. There are other areas where we'll have probably some differences. Let me just give an example. On the digital, we'll have some differences, because right now it's important to take into account that European Union institutions are discussing about what we call strategic autonomy. This is a kind of new strategic concept we are elaborating, but let me be clear about this. Strategic autonomy for us is not about Europe first. It's just about for us to take into account our own values and interests, but at the same time to push for a stronger and renewed multilateral system. So in Europe, we work with these two legs. One, looking after our interests and values, but the other one is really working with the others to strengthen the multilateral system. And that's why I want to make a final point is because by coincidence, FEPS has just concluded a quite big exercise on a renewed multilateralist system. We have concluded that we need, in fact, to have a new, fairer and more inclusive multilateral system. This means that when we speak about new, we want to deal with the new challenges. And one of them for us would be to have a more effective implementation of sustainable development goals. Also making a better use of the digital solutions. This is an area we would like to have more cooperation with the United States. Then if we speak about a fairer multilateralist system, we are in fact calling for a kind of a new global social contract, reducing social inequalities between countries, inside countries, and sometimes we need to be bolder in solutions. Example, when rethinking about taxation. And I'm just alluding to this because this can be a matter for different viewpoints, but we really need to discuss about this. And finally, when we speak about inclusive multilateral system, this means that we need to adapt this system to the current world. And what we see is that in order to tackle these new challenges, let's take just climate, we need to build up larger coalitions with all the countries, all the partners willing to tackle climate change. This has implications on the way to deal with China. Because from our viewpoint, China is certainly a major competitor, but can also be a partner for different purposes. Even at the end of the day, we have fundamental differences. And that's when the partnership with the United States is so important. Fundamental differences when it comes to democracy, fundamental rights, or intellectual property rights. So this is where we are now. in the current discussion in the European Union regarding the big good news coming from the United States. And I consider that a roundtable like our is today a very interesting input.
Many thanks, Mr. Rodrigues. I think we've received many questions. I'm going to start with an area of cooperation where there's a lot of need for transatlantic partners to do better. But for obvious reasons, many of you have certainly alluded to many of the obstacles remaining. There is some ambivalence. Mr. Rodrigues spoke about European strategic autonomy. We have a couple of questions focusing precisely on that. So the first one is addressed to Ambassador Nuland by Mr. Terry Stamatopoulos. He's asking whether a Biden administration, should go back to a stronger Europe means a stronger NATO, or whether, the White House should support building more collective European defense capabilities. And I think that ties well in with another question by Valeria Jagisman from Voice of America. Again, asking what the expectations from a Biden administration can be regarding the policy towards Eastern Europe, US troops in Germany, Russia, and the like. So Ambassador Nuland, why don't you start with those? And these are questions for everyone. Everyone sort of alluded to this problematique, so feel free to take.
Thanks, Vasilis, and greetings to Ambassador Stamatopoulos, who was my colleague and friend of many years when we worked together at NATO. Look, I don't think for a Biden administration it necessarily has to be an either or. You'll obviously have a renewed US investment in NATO and a commitment to our shared defense. I don't think that the Biden administration will be any less rigorous on the 2% of gross domestic product floor. There may be some ability to talk about how you define what you're building for security, because there are lots of new high-tech challenges that have to be addressed in different ways. But I also hope we'll be building more together at NATO and working on our capabilities jointly. That said, we have said before Trump, across two administrations, first George Bush 43, who I worked for as ambassador to NATO, and then across the Obama administration, that the United States has nothing to fear from increased European defense capabilities and its ability to work autonomously to protect itself and to deploy overseas, because any capabilities built for Europe to use on its own are also available to NATO or available to the UN. What's important to the United States is that as Europe begins its own build back better, that attention be paid to maintaining strong defense budgets and seeing security cooperation and security investments as part of the way that you stimulate your economy and you get people back to work and you innovate and go to next generation, and that we do that together. But at least speaking personally and going back to a general bipartisan consensus that we had before the Trump administration, Europeans need to commit to spend strongly, and Americans need to relax about whether they call it Europe, NATO, or Mars, frankly.
Many thanks, and I guess it's very timely that the European Council just recently announced that it has set conditions for third state participation in PESCO projects, for example. That could be a good step going forward. Anyone else from the panelists want to take that up? Jamie?
I'll just wait. I completely agree with Toria. I'll say though, as an American who's been living here in Berlin for the last several months, I fear that some Europeans try to hide behind the US on this, just to be blunt, try to hide behind the US on this issue. I mean, the reality is during the 4 years of the Trump administration, for the most part, they were broadly supportive of the posture that Toria laid out, not discouraging European efforts to do more together within Europe on defense. But the fundamental reality is there is significant distrust amongst European capitals about long-term strategic intentions of the other. Here in Berlin, I've been struck the last 2 months, you heard more negative commentary in the strategic community here about Emmanuel Macron than you did about Donald Trump. There's a lot of French-German debate about what European strategic autonomy truly means, what Paris's vision is versus what Berlin's is. And so some of this is just a European conversation that needs to proceed rather than hiding behind certain US administrations. And so hopefully a Biden administration, given its reaffirmation of strong US support for NATO, will allow some of that European debate to again restart. But I think a lot of the future of European autonomy is going to be decided here in Europe amongst European capitals. If they can come to an agreement, it's not going to be determined in Washington.
But I can say, Vasily, just very quickly, I can say that the nevertheless, in the past couple of years I've been here, I've been asked to explain numerous times to U.S. interlocutors our very important efforts in Europe on something we fully agree on altogether. To invest more together in defense, to research and develop more together, to produce more together, and to deploy more together. And that's the so-called PESCO and EDF initiatives. And they have not always been received that positively. And I think that what Toria said is very encouraging, because indeed, the Europeans began spending more on the defense from 2014-15, when Russia invaded Ukraine. I mean, it was quite clear from there to us that we had to take much better care of our own defense. But then we also realized that it's not just the amount you spend, but how efficiently you spend it. And in our case, there were tremendous inefficiencies. Keep in mind that the European Union member states are the second biggest defense spenders in the world after the US. We're not dealing with a situation where the EU is not spending money or its member states do not have defense capabilities. We're dealing sometimes with a situation where all this is quite inefficient. So I think us becoming much more united in trying to, through PESCO, EDF, joint initiatives to ensure that our spending is also more efficient, that strengthens NATO by definition. It also allows us to be a more credible defense payer and player in the region. That's good news for the US, no matter which way you look at it.
Vasilis,
many thanks, Ambassador. Ms. Rodrigues, please, yes.
Yeah. Well, on strategic autonomy, let me tell you the following. First of all, it seems to me clear that, in fact, Europeans should prepare themselves to become more self-sufficient when it comes to defense spending. Even, of course, they need to keep fully committed with the NATO framework. But I would like to also to refer that strategic autonomy is relevant for Europeans in other policy fields. Let me just refer to the digital one. Right now, we are having an important discussion in the European Union on something we can call the European way for the digital transformation, which might be somehow different from the American way and, of course, from the Chinese way. Because, first of all, we are defining a new framework to protect citizens' privacy. On this area, Europe is taking the lead. Secondly, because, of course, we pay attention to our choices regarding networks. So this discussion about 5G makes a lot of sense. Thirdly, because we would like to make sure that platforms, when operating in the European single market and benefiting from these, they should also pay somehow their fair share of taxation in order to finance big investments we need to have in Europe. Let's say providing digital skills for all citizens. And for sure, in the European way, we will put a lot of focus on using digital solutions to improve public services. So I'm just giving some examples where it's quite likely that Europe will make specific choices on the way to make the best of the digital transformation. And that's why we need also to define the kind of strategic autonomy you want. But that said, I repeat, we are also keen on developing a global governance for the digital transformation. So again, I'm coming back to our concern with updating the multilateral system.
Many thanks, Ms. Rodrigues. Certainly a lot. It's a very healthy discussion. It's bound to continue for months and years to come. But certainly, even from your reactions and some of these questions, I think there's considerable thirst for both transatlantic partners to do more together and to do better those things that they choose to do together. Perhaps a quick comment, because we have about 3-4 minutes left on environmental politics, certainly a priority for many Europeans. There is talk that the Republican Senate will mean less action on the U.S. side when it comes to climate action, when it comes to rejoining on upgrading the ambition within the Paris Agreement framework. Perhaps the two Americans on the panel can briefly comment on that, because we have many questions on that. Just very briefly. Jamie, why don't you start first?
I'd be rather pessimistic. As I mentioned before, I'm sure the Biden administration will re-enter Paris, will prioritize climate, but climate is one of the issues where, unless the Biden administration comes up with some new proposals which haven't been debated in American politics thus far, there's really no bipartisan common ground, or very little, on climate at this point. I'd also just note that one of the outcomes from the election over the last week has also been the start of a debate within the Democratic conference in the House about the Democratic Party's messaging. And part of the pushback in some areas has been on climate from the moderates, who felt that they were under significant pressure, that the so-called Green New Deal, pushed by other more progressive members of the House conference, perhaps almost cost them their seats and precluded them from being more successful. And so the climate, it's not that people are debating climate change itself necessarily, but the actual measures you take to respond to climate change are hotly debated, certainly on the right, but also a bit on the left. And so I think it's going to be a difficult issue to really get strong bipartisan support behind from this new Congress.
So I take the opposite view, not with regard to the Congress, but first of all, rejoining Paris is important in terms of setting a floor on what the United States ought to be doing and being able to advocate around the world. But there is also a huge amount a president needs to first undo from the Trump administration in terms of executive orders that have discouraged green investments, et cetera, at the state level. And there's a lot that can be done with the executive orders to encourage good climate action, which in the United States, as you know, happens largely at state level. I think the big unknown is whether the US and whether the Biden administration, in putting forward to Congress its stimulus package, its $80 billion in infrastructure investment and in research and development, will get support from a Republican Congress, A, for the dollar amount, and B, for doing what Europe is trying to do, which is tying that federal money to rebuilding greener and smarter and less carbon dependent. And you know, we'll just have to see. I would note that the Republican demographic is also changing on climate. The vast majority, I think it's 65% of Republican voters under 35 favor climate action, including at the federal level. So, you know, that's a different matter than the Green New Deal, which is now dead and did have a lot of government diktat to it. But I do think tying recovery money to building back smarter and better is going to be a more bipartisan supported activity than perhaps otherwise thought. The question is going to be the dollar amount, I think.
And if I may,
many thanks.
Vasily,
Yes, very briefly.
Very quickly on this.
Yeah.
So indeed, as opposed to Europe, the issue of the environment is a very partisan issue in the U.S. If you poll the voters, you will see the Republicans consider it a very low priority, the Democrats very high priority, etc. For us in Europe, that sounds strange because across the political spectrum, whether you're conservative or liberal in Europe, you believe that you have to attack climate change, and you also think that there's an economic benefit in doing so. So, as Toria said, the state and the municipal level are very important. We work as European Union very closely with them. A president, if he doesn't have Congress with him on many of these issues, he may, but if he doesn't, he has his executive orders, then he has administrating rulemaking as a federal tool in his hands to make a difference, but probably not as big one as he would like to without congressional support. But there again, I see a tremendous opportunity for cooperation. There are states around this country, and this is an argument that has actually failed to penetrate, I think, who belong in a U.S. state climate alliance of sorts, right? They represent about 60% of the population of the U.S., or 65%, about 70% of the GDP of the U.S. Interesting, in the past few years, if you look at the trends between carbon emission reductions in those states and GDP growth, you will see that the states that have reduced most the carbon emissions have actually increased most their GDP, which is the US experience as well. There's a lot of good conversations to be had, a lot of information to share, and maybe we'll come closer on this issue because it's huge for our economies, our people, and the world, frankly.
Many thanks, Ambassador, for that uplifting note to end on. I've been told we have to wrap up. Let me thank once more a wonderful panel, Ambassadors Nuland and Lambrinidis, Jamie Fly and Maria João Rodrigues. Let me thank once more the teams at FEPS and GMF and FEPS for all the hard work put into this. This is an excellent annual partnership going back years and with many years ahead, I hope. And of course, many thanks to all of you for attending, submitting questions, actively participating. I will leave you with a very short poem by W.H. Auden, which may or may not bear resemblance to current affairs. The poem is titled Epitaph on a Tyrant, and W.H. Auden wrote it some 8 decades ago.
So Vasily, you had to find a poem with the Greek. You had to find a poem with the Greek word in its title.
Next time, Ambassador, it's a promise.
Good for you.
Yeah. He says, perfection of a kind was what he was after, and the poetry he invented was easy to understand. He knew human folly like the back of his hand and was greatly interested in armies and fleets. When he laughed, respectable senators burst with laughter, and when he cried, the little children died in the streets. Many thanks to all. Have a beautiful afternoon. Goodbye.